The hangar cost Marcus Tillman exactly $1. That was the listed price on the county's surplus auction website, under a category that read miscellaneous agricultural and industrial structures, which was the kind of bureaucratic description that made a thing sound like nothing worth thinking about. Marcus had found it at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, the way he found most things that changed his life, which was to say by accident, while looking for something else entirely, and falling sideways into a rabbit hole he hadn't planned to enter. He had been searching for salvage yards within driving distance of Tucson because he needed a replacement alternator for his truck, and somewhere between the third and fourth page of results, the county auction listing had appeared, and he had clicked it because the thumbnail showed a building large enough to park several aircraft inside, and the price was $1, and Marcus Tillman had never in his life been able to scroll past something that made no logical sense. The listing description was spare to the point of being unhelpful. Structure located on 17 acres of high desert property, Pinal County, Arizona. Steel frame construction, corrugated exterior, concrete foundation. Condition unknown. Property conveyed as is. Minimum bid $1. No reserve. The county accepts no liability for any contents, structures, subsurface features, or conditions of any kind discovered on or within the property following transfer of title. That last sentence was the kind of sentence that lawyers put into documents when they know something about a property that they would rather you discover on your own after the paperwork is signed. Marcus had read it 4 times, understood it completely, and placed a bid for $1 at 2:17 in the morning, which was the only bid the auction ever received, and which made him the legal owner of 17 acres of Arizona desert and one very large, very old hangar building at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning 6 days later. He drove out to see it the following weekend in the truck with the bad alternator, which made the drive an exercise in optimism. And what he found when he turned off the 2-lane county road onto a dirt track that the GPS identified as a private access road was not what the thumbnail had prepared him for. The hangar was enormous. That part matched the photo. What the photo had not conveyed was the degree to which the structure had been swallowed by time and the specific hostility that the Sonoran Desert directs toward anything built by human hands. The corrugated steel exterior had gone the color of old blood where it wasn't simply rust, and the rust had done impressive work on the lower third of the walls, opening holes in several places large enough for a man to walk through without ducking. The 2 main doors, heavy rolling affairs on a track that must have once allowed large aircraft to move in and out, had separated at some point, one standing slightly open at a 20-degree angle that suggested the track had warped, the other having fallen entirely and lying on the concrete apron in front of the building like something that had given up. The concrete apron itself was fractured into irregular sections by decades of freeze-thaw cycles and the relentless upward pressure of plant life that didn't know when it wasn't wanted. Creosote bushes had established themselves in the larger gaps. A saguaro cactus of considerable age stood in the precise center of the fallen door, which meant it had been growing there for at least 40 years, which told Marcus something about how long the door had been down. He stood in the desert heat in front of all of this and took a long drink from his water bottle and looked at his $1 purchase and thought, well, there it is. Marcus Tillman was 39 years old, recently divorced, recently relocated from the city he'd lived in for 15 years, and recently unemployed in the sense that he had quit his job as a structural engineer rather than continue doing it, which was a decision that had made enormous sense to him at the time, and continued to make sense to him in the way that decisions do when you've made them irrevocably and can't afford to question them. He had a decent amount of savings, a truck with a bad alternator, and a storage unit in Tucson containing the portion of his previous life that hadn't been divided or sold. He had come to Arizona because it was somewhere he had never been and had no associations with, which had seemed, at the time, like sufficient reason. He had not come looking for a $1 hangar, but he recognized, standing in front of it in the September heat with sweat already soaking through his shirt, that this was the kind of thing his life had apparently decided to do next, and he had learned enough about his own nature to know that arguing with it was a waste of everyone's time. He walked through the gap in the fallen door, past the saguaro, and into the hangar. The interior was large enough that the far wall was in shadow despite the gaps in the exterior that let in substantial light. The concrete floor was in better shape than the outside had suggested, cracked in places, stained extensively, but fundamentally solid underfoot, the way well-poured mid-century concrete tended to be when it had been sheltered from the worst of the weather. The ceiling was a lattice of steel trusses that had held, probably because they were largely protected from the moisture cycles that had destroyed the lower sections of the walls. A network of catwalks ran along both sides at approximately 30 feet, connected by a center span, and most of them appeared to be intact. The hangar was not empty. Marcus had expected emptiness, or close to it, old equipment perhaps, debris, the accumulated junk of abandonment. What he found instead was a single object occupying roughly the rear two-thirds of the floor space, covered in canvas tarps that had once been green and were now a uniform gray-brown, weighted down at the edges by old engine blocks and lengths of steel pipe and other heavy objects that had been placed with deliberate care to keep the canvas tight and in position. The object under the tarps was large, very large. It had a profile that Marcus's engineer's eye tried to categorize and kept failing to, because the shapes it resolved into under the canvas didn't correspond to any aircraft he knew of. The forward section suggested something like a fuselage but broader, flatter, with a curve to the underside that didn't match any conventional aerodynamic design. The rear section was hidden under a separate section of canvas that overlapped the first, and whatever was under it had a different profile entirely, irregular, angular, suggesting either structural damage or components that had been partially disassembled. He walked around it slowly, trailing one hand along the canvas without touching what was underneath. The scale of it was difficult to process in the shadowed interior. He paced the length and counted his steps and came up with something over 90 feet, which was too long for any aircraft he could name that would have been stored in an inland Arizona hangar in what he estimated, based on the construction style and the age of the equipment around him, was probably the 1960s or 1970s. He found a corner of the canvas near the forward section and lifted it. The hull underneath was metal, or something that had the properties of metal but a surface texture unlike any alloy he recognized, dark gray, with a faint iridescence that shifted as the light caught it at different angles, smooth to the touch in a way that felt almost frictionless, without the grain or pore structure that any cast or forged or rolled metal would have. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt no temperature differential, which was wrong, because any metal surface that had been sitting in an unventilated Arizona structure through a September day should have been hot enough to blister. Marcus stood very still with his hand on the hull for a long moment. Then he went back to his truck and got his flashlight and his notepad and came back inside and started taking notes, because he was an engineer, and when an engineer encounters something that makes no sense, the correct response is to begin documenting it carefully until it does. It took him 3 weeks of weekends and 2 full weeks of weekdays to uncover the entire object. He worked methodically, removing the canvas sections one at a time, photographing each section as it was revealed, taking measurements, writing descriptions. He borrowed a portable generator from a friend in Tucson and ran work lights off it to eliminate the problem of inconsistent natural light through the rusted holes in the walls. He ate his meals sitting on an overturned equipment crate and slept in the back of the truck on an air mattress, and was, he recognized, happier than he had been in several years, which told him something about himself that he filed away to think about later. What the canvas concealed in its entirety was a vessel, not an aircraft. Marcus was certain of that within the first week, and more certain with each subsequent day of examination. The aerodynamic principles that governed aircraft design were present in some of the vessel's features: smooth curves, attention to surface continuity, but they were present as secondary characteristics, the way a submarine might have aerodynamic qualities without being designed for flight. The primary design logic of the vessel was oriented around something else, something that Marcus couldn't fully articulate, but that his engineer's instincts kept trying to reach toward. It was built for pressure differential. That was the closest he could come to it, working from the structural principles that were legible in the design. The hull was built to maintain an interior environment against an exterior environment with radically different properties. The seals around the access points, there were 3, which he identified after extended examination, were of a complexity and precision that made the best aerospace engineering he'd ever seen look casual. The structural members visible through the access points in the damaged rear section were arranged in patterns he'd never encountered, but that he could read, once he spent enough time with them, as solutions to stress problems that didn't match any environment he'd worked in. At the end of the second week, sitting in his work lights with his notebook full, and his mind running at a frequency he hadn't felt since graduate school, Marcus Tillman came to a conclusion that he approached carefully and from several directions before he let himself hold it directly. The vessel had not been built by any human agency he knew of. He sat with that for a while. Then he went back to looking at the hull, because the hull was real and in front of him, and the conclusions he was drawing from it were his to draw. And he had learned enough about himself to know that he worked best when he stayed close to the concrete evidence and let the implications build themselves out of that rather than the other way around. The damage to the rear section was extensive. Whatever had happened to it, and something had clearly happened, at some point before the vessel had been moved into this hangar, had deformed the hull plating in ways that suggested an impact event, something that had struck from outside with tremendous force and penetrated partially through the outer layers before stopping. The damaged sections showed material that had not merely bent or cracked but changed, at the molecular level, based on how it caught the light. Whatever the hull was made of, it had responded to the impact by doing something Marcus had no vocabulary for. Not failing. Something more complex than failing. Something that looked, when he studied it long enough, almost like the material had made a decision about how to distribute the damage. He photographed every inch of the damaged section. He made drawings. He took material samples, or tried to. 3 different drill bits failed to make any impression on the hull's surface, which told him something important about the material properties even though it told him nothing about the composition. On the 3rd weekend, he found the access panel. It was on the underside of the forward section, flush with the hull and almost invisible against the iridescent surface. He found it by running his hands along the hull in a systematic grid pattern in the hours when the light was wrong for photography, and he felt the edge of it before he saw it. A panel approximately 3 feet by 4, with no visible hinges and no mechanism he could identify, that responded when he pressed it in 2 places simultaneously by clicking softly and swinging inward on an axis that was somehow supported without visible hardware. The interior was dark, and the smell that came out of it was nothing he could name, not decay, not chemicals, not metal, but something present nonetheless, something that existed in the olfactory space usually occupied by old things that had been sealed for a long time. He shone his flashlight in. The interior of the forward section was intact. Not merely structurally intact, functionally intact, or something close to it. He could see surfaces that were clearly control interfaces of some kind, arranged in an ergonomic pattern that suggested a crew of somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on how you thought about the space distribution. The materials were pristine, not merely undamaged but active-looking, surfaces that seemed to have a depth to them that went beyond their physical dimensions. And running along the center of the main console, built into the surface in a way that was impossible to remove without destroying the surrounding structure, was a data storage medium. Marcus could tell it was a data storage medium because it was doing something. Quietly, barely, at a level that was almost below detection, but it was emitting a signal, a low-frequency pulse that his phone's signal detector app picked up when he held it close to the surface. A heartbeat. Something in the vessel, sealed in this hangar for decades, was still running. He sat in front of the open access panel for a long time, in the desert heat with his flashlight and his phone and his notebook, and thought about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was Helen Park. He called her because she was the only person he knew who had both a doctorate in materials science and a personal policy of not asking too many questions before agreeing to do something interesting. They had been friends since graduate school, had remained friends through the intervening years and the diverging careers and the respective disasters of their personal lives, and she was living in Phoenix, which was close enough to drive. He described what he had found without telling her what he thought it was, because he wanted her first assessment to be uncontaminated by his. She drove out on a Saturday morning with a cooler full of drinks and a hard case full of equipment, and stood in the door of the hangar for a full 30 seconds before she said, very quietly, "Marcus, what is this?" He said, "That's what I need you to help me figure out." She spent 4 hours on initial examination before she said anything else of substance. He watched her work with the appreciation of someone who recognized a thorough mind in operation and knew better than to interrupt it. She ran tests he didn't have the equipment for, using instruments from her case that he could identify by category, spectrometer, surface roughness analyzer, thermal conductivity probe, but whose readings he couldn't interpret on her screens. She took samples that his drill bits hadn't been able to reach by using an apparatus that applied focused acoustic energy to the surface rather than mechanical pressure, which extracted material fragments measured in micrograms and placed them on prepared slides with the care of someone handling things that mattered. When she was done, she stood up and stretched her back and looked at the vessel for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Marcus, the thermal conductivity of this hull material is approximately 0, as in it doesn't conduct heat at all, as in that number is not possible for any material I know of. And the surface roughness." She looked at her notebook. Average surface roughness of approximately 0.3 nanometers. For reference, the smoothest surfaces humans can manufacture, using processes that require billions of dollars of equipment, achieve approximately 0.5 nanometers. This was made somehow to a higher tolerance than our best technology can currently achieve. And the pulse, the signal. She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "I've been thinking about that since you described it on the phone. I've been trying to find an explanation that fits inside what I know." She paused. "I haven't found one." They sat in the heat in front of the open access panel and looked at the active console inside, and Helen said, "So what do we do?" Marcus had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. He had an answer, but it was the kind of answer that required a certain amount of what he privately called moral commitment. The act of deciding that a thing was real, and you were going to proceed on that basis regardless of how strange it was, because proceeding on any other basis was a form of dishonesty about what you were actually looking at. "We figure out how to read it," he said. "The signal is data. Data is language. Language can be learned. We find out what it's saying." Helen looked at the console for a moment. "That could take years." He shrugged. "I've got a $1 hangar and nowhere to be." It took 14 months. Not 14 months of continuous work. The first 4 months were largely consumed by the practical problems of making the hangar functional as a working space, which required money that Marcus managed by taking on structural consulting work remotely, and by the problem of power, which was solved by a solar installation that took 3 weeks to build and which Helen designed and Marcus constructed on the roof of the hangar with the specific satisfaction of building something with his hands that served a clear purpose. The hangar's walls were patched enough to keep the worst of the weather out. The catwalks were reinforced. A proper work area was established, with tables and equipment and a sleeping space that was better than the truck bed. The signal from the console was the thread they pulled on. It was not, as Marcus had initially thought, a simple heartbeat, a passive emission from a power source still running after decades. As Helen's analysis progressed and their understanding of the frequency and structure of the emission improved, it became clear that the signal was structured. Not in any way that mapped to human communication protocols, but structured in the mathematical sense that certain sequences repeated, certain intervals were consistent, certain patterns occurred at predictable intervals. It was language in the way that mathematics is language. Not a human language, not an arbitrary system of symbols, but a system of relationships that expressed something real about the universe and could, therefore, be read by anyone with sufficient mathematics to follow the relationships. The breakthrough came 14 months in, on a Tuesday morning in November, when Helen was running the latest iteration of her analysis software against the signal pattern, and the pattern did something it had not done before. It changed. Not dramatically, the fundamental pulse continued, but a secondary layer of the signal, a layer that had been there from the beginning, but that their analysis had been treating as carrier noise, resolved suddenly into something that was clearly responsive. It had detected the analysis software's queries. It had been, for some period of time, listening to them attempt to listen to it. And now it was answering. The answer was not in words. It was in mathematics, a series of numerical relationships that Helen worked through over 6 hours with a focus that reminded Marcus of watching a musician play a piece they'd spent years learning. What the mathematics expressed, when she had mapped it fully, was a set of coordinates. Not spatial coordinates, or not purely spatial. A framework for locating something in 4 dimensions, 3 of space, and one that both of them spent considerable time working through before they arrived at the word that fit it best. Time. The vessel was telling them where it had come from, where and when. Not in human terms, the numbers weren't dates on any calendar Marcus knew, but in terms of relative position within the physical universe, which was something that could be checked against known astronomical data. Marcus spent 3 weeks writing software to do the translation, working from the astronomical databases that were publicly accessible through the university servers Helen still had access to as an adjunct. And when the translation was complete, he sat in front of his screen in the hangar and looked at the result. The coordinates resolved to a location approximately 40 light-years from Earth, a star system that appeared in the astronomical databases under a catalog number that meant nothing to most people, but that, when Marcus searched for additional data on it, turned out to have been the subject of a 2019 paper by a radio telescope team that had noted an anomalous signal in its vicinity and flagged it for follow-up observation that, as far as the public record showed, had never been scheduled. The time coordinate was harder to interpret because the vessel's frame of reference for time was not Earth's frame of reference for time, but the mathematical relationships, when worked through to their conclusion, suggested a departure point that was not in the future or the distant past. It suggested something much stranger and much simpler. The vessel had departed its origin point approximately 90 years ago, by its own internal reckoning, on a journey that should have taken a fraction of that time. Something had gone wrong. The damage to the rear section, the unplanned arrival in an Arizona desert, the decades of concealment in a county surplus hangar. Something had gone very wrong, a very long time ago, and the vessel had been sitting here waiting for someone to find it and read what it was telling them. "There's a crew manifest," Helen said one evening, 2 months after the signal had begun responding to them. She was looking at her screen with the expression she wore when she was being careful about the language she chose. The secondary data layer isn't just coordinates. There's a crew manifest. How many? She looked at him. 4. And based on the data structure surrounding those entries, some of them are listed as in emergency stasis, present tense, in the system's present tense. Marcus was very still, in the vessel. She nodded slowly. He looked at the access panel, closed now, on the underside of the forward section. The vessel that was junk from the outside. The vessel that was 90 years of waiting from the inside. They went back to the signal. They asked it, in the mathematical language they had spent 14 months learning, whether it could show them the rest. It could. The full data transfer took 11 days. What it contained was a picture of a civilization that had, approximately 9 decades ago, sent 4 explorers to a star system they had identified as inhabited, with the intention of making contact. The explorers had encountered something en route, an anomaly in the region between their home system and their destination, a gravitational irregularity that wasn't supposed to be there, and wasn't fully understood by the civilization that sent them, but that had been assessed as navigable. It wasn't. The vessel had been damaged severely, its navigation system destroyed, its faster-than-light capability reduced to something between nothing and barely functional. It had fallen through the anomaly at a vector that had deposited it, after a journey of decades at a fraction of its intended velocity, in the gravitational influence of a star that turned out to be the destination it had originally been seeking. Earth, the inhabited system they had been sent to contact. The 4 crew members had engaged the emergency stasis systems when it became clear that they were falling into the target system damaged and at low velocity, and with no way to communicate their approach without risking a response they couldn't handle in their condition. They had sealed themselves in. They had left the signal running. They had waited. For 90 years. Sealed in a stasis system in the rear section of a damaged vessel in a county surplus hangar in Arizona, 4 beings who had set out to say hello to humanity had been waiting for someone to find the door. Marcus sat with this for a day before he said anything to Helen, because it was the kind of information that required a day of sitting before it was fully real. He walked around the hangar. He looked at the vessel from every angle. He thought about the county surplus auction listing, about the $1, about the sentence regarding liability for contents discovered following transfer of title. Then he said to Helen, "We need to figure out how to open the stasis system, and we need to figure out what we're going to say." She looked at the vessel, and then what? "And then we introduce ourselves." He thought about it. "We're reasonably good at that. We've been practicing for a long time." The stasis system was in the rear section, accessible through one of the 3 entry points Marcus had identified in the damaged area. The damage that had made the rear section so difficult to examine from the outside had not penetrated to the interior. The structural complexity he had observed in the exposed framework had, it turned out, been exactly the defense it looked like. A set of redundant support systems that had absorbed and redirected the impact energy before it could reach the vessel's core. The stasis chambers were intact. The 4 chambers were intact. The mathematics of the vessel's communication system, applied to the stasis controls, revealed a process, a warm-up sequence, a revival protocol that the vessel had been designed to walk someone through from the outside, anticipating the scenario in which the crew could not revive themselves. The anticipation of this scenario, built into a vessel designed for contact with unknown civilizations, said something about the beings who had built it that Marcus found he liked enormously. They had planned for needing help. They had built the assumption of outside assistance into the system. They had designed for trust. He and Helen worked through the revival protocol over 3 days, checking each step against the mathematical framework they had built, making sure they understood what each action would do before they did it. The vessel's signal became more active during this period, responding to their queries with something that felt, and Marcus was careful with the word, but couldn't find a better one, felt like encouragement. An active interest in their progress, something that in a human system he would have called eagerness. On a Thursday morning in early March, with the desert beginning to warm toward spring and the saguaro in the middle of the fallen door, putting out the first of its annual crown of white flowers, Marcus Tillman and Helen Park completed the final step of the revival protocol. The rear section of the vessel hummed, not loudly, a subsonic vibration that Marcus felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. The iridescent hull surface shifted in its color depth in a way it hadn't before, a ripple moving from rear to forward like something waking up. The access panel in the rear section, the one Marcus had identified but not been able to open because it required a sequence he hadn't known, clicked open. Warm air came out. Air that was neither the dry heat of the desert nor the recycled staleness of the sealed interior, but something in between, treated, filtered, carrying the same unnamed quality as the original smell from the forward access panel, but warmer now, and with something underneath it that Marcus's nervous system processed before his brain did, some chemical signal that his body responded to as non-threatening before he had consciously decided to agree. They waited. The first one out was the smallest, smaller than Marcus had expected, though he recognized immediately that he had no basis for his expectations and that they were his problem, not the vessel's. Roughly humanoid in the sense that the structure was bilateral and upright, but the proportions and the number of functional limbs and the surface qualities of the being in front of him resolved into a specific shape that his brain attempted to map to familiar categories and eventually stopped trying, because it was its own category and that was fine. It stood in the access hatch and looked at him. Large sensory organs in the head region, adapted for a light spectrum he couldn't fully assess. A posture that conveyed, and this was Marcus's read, his human pattern recognition imposing interpretation on biology, but he trusted it. A posture that conveyed 90 years of relief finally having somewhere to land. He raised one hand, open palm outward. The being looked at his hand for a moment. Then it raised one of its own, three-fingered, jointed differently, but raised in a gesture of such obvious intentional parallel that Marcus felt something happen in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hello," he said, knowing it couldn't understand the word. But he said it anyway, because the word was less important than the saying of it, and because this was the moment that four beings had waited 90 years for, and he wasn't going to greet it in silence. 3 more followed. The revival protocol worked for all 4, which told Marcus that whatever had kept the stasis system running through 9 decades of Arizona desert had been very well built, and he spent a moment appreciating the engineering the way he appreciated all good engineering, with a specific quiet satisfaction that was one of the most reliable pleasures in his life. The communication that followed was not like the mathematical language of the vessel's signal. It was harder, slower, more ambiguous, full of gestures and repeated attempts, and the particular frustration and joy of 2 minds reaching toward each other across a gap with no common ground except the willingness to keep reaching. Marcus used his engineering background to construct physical demonstrations. Helen used her materials science background to build a shared vocabulary of observable properties. The 4 beings used methods Marcus couldn't always follow, but that produced results, an expression, a demonstration, a pattern of interaction that narrowed the gap incrementally, the way all gaps narrow when the people on both sides of them are committed to the narrowing. They were committed, all 6 of them. That much was clear from the first hour and remained clear through the days that followed, as a working communication system grew slowly out of nothing, the way all real languages grow, from necessity and repeated contact and the stubborn human, and it turned out not exclusively human, refusal to stop trying. The county was going to want the hangar back eventually. Some bureaucrat would notice that the $1 auction had gone to a private individual, and that 17 acres of Pinal County desert were no longer technically county property, and that would create a process that would require other processes. And at some point, the situation would be larger than 2 people in a patched-up building, with a vessel that nobody officially knew about. Marcus was aware of this. He was also aware that the moment the situation became officially known about, It would leave his hands entirely, which meant that the time he had right now, sitting in the work lights he'd strung from the catwalks, across a folding table from four beings who had crossed 40 light years to say hello and spent 90 years waiting in a broken vessel for someone to answer, was irreplaceable time. The only time like it that would ever exist. So he sat in it. He worked at the language. He tried things and failed and tried differently. He passed Helen a note at one point that said, "Do you realize we are going to be footnotes in history?" And she wrote back, "Footnotes are fine. I always liked footnotes." And he laughed, and the four beings reacted to his laughter with an interest that turned into an attempt to identify and replicate the mechanism of it, which was one of the stranger and more wonderful 15 minutes of Marcus's life. He thought, sometimes, about the auction listing, about the county's careful legal language disclaiming liability for anything found within the property, about the fact that $1 had purchased not merely a building, but the beginning of something that had no precedent in human history and no roadmap and no rules yet written. He thought about how things worked that way sometimes, how the significant things arrived not in the shape you expected, not announced, not ceremonial, not daylight visible, but sideways at 2 in the morning, in a bad search result you weren't looking for, at a price that made no sense. He thought about this, and then he went back to work, because the people across the table from him had waited 90 years for this moment, and the least he could do was be fully present for it. Outside, the saguaro bloomed in the March light. The desert was the same desert it had always been, patient and indifferent and quietly full of things that had been waiting, in their own ways, much longer than 90 years. Inside, 6 people, the word was approximate, and Marcus had started using it deliberately, because accuracy in the small things was how you built accuracy in the large things. 6 people sat around a folding table and built something new out of nothing, one word at a time. It was slow work. It was the best work Marcus had ever done. He wouldn't have traded the $1 for anything.